Today I am joined by my brother in arms against the great heavy spoilers, Ryan Arey from ScreenCrush. Ryan, I only have you for a limited time because you got some things to tend to.
Making me feel terrible about it.
No. Growing up, who was your celebrity crush and why?
I was like a little kid, but I was like, ooh, girls are pretty. You know, I kind of had that mindset with it.
Which character would you say that you most identify with?
I always felt really lonely as a kid. So Luke Skywalker has that aspect as well.
What is the kind of thing in a movie that tends to make you cry the most?
For me, I think it's sacrifice. It's somebody giving all of themselves to someone else simply because it's the right thing to do.
I gotta say, the start of this, I was like, okay, maybe this will be the biggest joke-heavy podcast we've done.
I can do that. I can be insincere if you want.
Please, for the love of God, Ryan. Well, hello there, citizens of the Reject Nation. Welcome to another episode of Diary of a Real Reject. Today, I am joined by my brother in arms against the great heavy spoilers, Ryan Arey from ScreenCrush, who's actually a really great guy. Ryan, I only have you for a limited time, less than all the other guests we've ever had, because you got some things to tend to.
Well, wait, how long do the other guests stay for? I feel bad now.
They've been here for like an hour and a half, 2 hours. They're usually like, I don't want to leave, Greg. I want to stay.
Normally that would be my case, but man, with the holidays, I got things to break down, my friend. Like, it is Easter egg season out there right now.
What show are we joining Ryan Arey for in Los Angeles?
We're doing a live show. I believe it's on January 12th, but you can just search ScreenCrush live show on Google. I don't know the address, but you'll find it. It's with X1 Entertainment. That's us. And yeah, we're really looking forward to it. We got some really cool stuff planned. We're going to do exclusive breakdowns. I'm going to rope this guy into reacting to some stuff.
Sure.
I hope. I haven't even asked him yet. I'm asking him now. It's going to be a lot of fun. Come on out. Can't wait to meet you guys.
I love your hosting voice. You got that switch. You know that
you have dulcet tones, my friend. I like that we also each have disc plates behind us.
Yeah.
I don't know if you've caught onto that, but yeah, these are the textured ones, you know?
Yeah. I love
textra.
them.
Yeah.
I love your whole set. And I was talking with Ryan beforehand for like a second, and he was saying he's never seen an episode of this. So Ryan, here's how it works. On this show, we talk about movies, TV shows, and possibly celebrities of how they have helped shape our identities. So
okay.
I'm not going to be. Maybe we talk about Marvel and all the crap that people usually tune in for the great Ryan Arey for. But I want to give a really sincere thank you to Ryan for being a really supportive guy. I remember when we had our one and only Comic-Con panel thus far, Ryan did go out of his way to attend with his wife. And he was the only other person at Comic-Con who is a friend of mine who has a YouTube channel who actually showed up to our event.
It was great.
And that really means
out. No, you guys put on it. You just did a Q&A the whole time. It was amazing. You ran that shit. Yeah.
I appreciate it. We had you talk for a little bit too, for like 1 second. And it just really means a lot that you actually showed up. Yeah. I also wanted to use it as an opportunity to throw shade at everyone else who I know who was at Comic-Con and did not actually attend.
Yeah. So many fake friends out there, unlike us.
The
real friends.
Or the real deal.
That sort of dedication, though, is why I have a harder out than your usual guest, because I got to go catch another panel.
I understand.
With another friend on it. It keeps me really busy. So, yeah.
Totally get it. Well, Ryan, here's my opening question that I tend to ask everyone. And I love how you haven't seen any of these because this allows me to just have you going very fresh here.
Well, you're making me feel terrible about it.
No.
I don't even watch our own videos anymore.
This is more exciting to me. Ryan, growing up, who was your celebrity crush growing up and why?
My celebrity crush growing up. Gosh, who would that have been? I think probably the first celebrity crush I remember as a kid was Pamela Wells from Teen Wolf. Remember the whole thing with the dressing room and stuff? That was like the first time I remember. I was like a little kid, but I was like, ooh, girls are pretty. You know, I kind of had that mindset with it.
Pamela Wells from Teen Wolf? I want to look her up.
Yeah, the character's
really
name is Pamela Wells. She was the character, like the blonde woman that like that flirts with the Teen Wolf and stuff, but she only loves him because he's a wolf and not for the real him, like that person.
Oh, my goodness.
As far as like another crush that I had, Belle from Beauty and the Beast. Nah,
I mean, it could be.
Yeah, that's a good one. Geez, man, that put me on the spot more than like I was expecting. Favorite movie, favorite TV show.
Yeah, not this show.
No,
man.
That's a good question. No, it's a good question. I'm not trying to duck it. Believe me. My crush from child. What are we talking? Like teenage years?
I'll
or
give you
just
an
like as a kid? Okay.
I'll give you an example for me, which is weird because I've asked this question to like a few people now, and no one's actually ever asked me back. So I'm just going to use it as opportunity to insert my little answer here, which is Nev Campbell from Scream. Undoubtedly, she was my favorite,
That's a great one.
and maybe I had like a like hero savior complex. I think where like it was weird. Like growing up, I'm like, oh, I want to protect her, I want to save her. Then I found that like everyone I was attracted to kind of resembled the pale sadness of Nev Campbell in that movie. Then when I got older, I
I mean, if
realized
you're
the
gonna
strength.
go with the Nev Campbell movie, what about Denise Richards from Wild Things? I mean,
Okay,
that yeah, or Denise Richards from Starship Troopers, or Denise Richards from James or literally anything Denise Richards has ever in. You can't really go wrong with that answer.
that's true. Well, what I'm curious of going to though is like you immediately answered Pamela Wells. Her name's Lori Griffin. I see here.
That's it, yeah. She wasn't in very much, though, I don't think.
What do you think it was about, her as a crush, though? Like, it took me a long time to realize the psychology behind, "Oh,
What
here's
kind of
why I."
podcast is this, Greg?
This is a very
What is
in-depth,
this going on?
personal
Is
one.
this
I found another podcast called Talking Movies recently that aims for the same thing,
yeah.
and I'm like, "Hell no, we're gonna go way deeper than that."
Okay,
So,
okay, okay.
yeah.
No, I don't know. I just because you said childhood, so I was trying to remember, like, as a child, who it was that was like so I went back to, like, the original, um, person. I didn't know that I would actually say what was her name? Lori Griffin?
Lori Griffin.
Griffith? Griffin, okay.
Yeah.
I don't know that I would say yeah, I'm like, "Oh, what's her name?" And I've got her poster, like, right over here, and, like, I've, like, tracked her down on the internet, and I'm outside of her place with some binoculars, and I can see her from across the street. No, I don't know, like, I wouldn't say there's anything about her. I just remember, like, because her whole thing in that movie is being, like, the sex pot that Scott has a crush on. So maybe that was it. Maybe at a very young age, I was like, "Oh, that's the kinda girls you have crushes on,"
Oh,
and that was, like,
interesting.
the idea. It could have been that, I don't know, but she was, like, a typical cheerleader, blonde cheerleader in an '80s movie kinda thing.
That's fair.
But as far as, like, I don't know, if you look at and go, well, when you were growing up, obviously, when you're a teenager, you got a crush on anything that moves, which is
Sure.
why I wouldn't have even thought of Denise Richards and Wild Things until you said Nev Campbell, and I was like, "Well, if we're gonna go there,
Yeah.
you could look at those movies."
Or Belle from Beauty and the Beast, yeah, huh? Eh?
Or Belle from Beauty and the Beast, yeah.
Yeah.
But, it would have been weirder if I would have said Ariel before she's transformed. Like, let's just be clear, Belle from Beauty and the Beast is not the weirdest
We're
crush that
looking
I
for
could
that
have laid out
honesty,
on
though.
you.
We want that honesty. Like,
Yeah,
I
yeah, but I
actually
mean,
would
there's
meet you there.
honesty, and then there's Fiona from Shrek, but, like, at the end of the movie, that's getting into a whole other thing. Um, I always liked Beverly Crusher, or not Beverly Crusher, Deanna Troi on
Mhm.
TNG. Yeah, that was an
Mm.
early crush. Jerry Ryan, of course, on, Voyager was always a crush, but, like, that I was a little bit older, when she joined the show, so I wouldn't call that a childhood because there's childhood crushes, and then there's teen crushes, and teen crushes are very different and gross.
Absolutely.
So, yeah, I think as far as a childhood crush the other thing too, that I remember being like but you remember Leah Thompson in Back to the Future?
Of course, of course.
Yeah, see, that was one too, where that was like, I remember distinctly thinking, "That's a pretty lady.
No. Were you attracted to your mom also?
Hey, that's your mom."
That's your mom. That joke in your videos, I fall for it every time. Every
Well, we
time.
try, we
It
try.
never fails to miss me, and every time I'm, like, by myself on the phone, I'm like, "Huh, son of a bitch got me again." It's always like that classic
We
"got
try
me
to
again."
catch you off guard when you're pooping. That's really the trick to it.
That's how I enjoy a good screen crush video. So let me ask you this then. Let me ask you this. That's the best podcast thing to say. Let me ask you this. Let me ask you this.
Okay, let me ask you. Bring it in.
So I did not actually get to know your wife that well, unfortunately. That is a
Mhm,
thing that like
mhm.
kind
Yeah,
of
me
bothers
neither.
me. Yeah, yeah.
She's still
Still
a
working
mystery
on
to
it.
me too.
Still working
Yeah,
on it.
yeah, we're
Which
working on that.
which movie character would you say, movie or TV show character would you say personality wise best resembles her that you would most liken her to?
I'm really a lot like Lori Griffin, as Pamela Wells in the movie Teen Wolf. Just a second here. Oh, yeah, she is. She's right outside. I can see her right over there.
I knew that this
Um,
would be the least sincere one that I've done the entire
yeah.
time. I just knew it.
Uh, yeah, no, I mean, I don't talk I keep like, my Instagram is private for a reason. Like, I don't really talk about, family stuff that much because my wife's, not in the business, so I don't usually talk about her. But, what was it? But I'll tell you some nuggets, because that's what we're doing here today. What was the question again? Sorry.
The question was like, just that way there is a bit of a healthy distance in terms of separation with not exposing who your wife really is.
Mhm.
which character would you say in movie or TV shows is the most like her? Just so I could kinda have a better understanding of
Uh,
what her personality might be like.
my wife is such an amazing person, and I know this sounds like a generic answer, but it's not. She really is the funniest person I know, the
Mhm.
most beautiful woman I know, uh, the kindest person that I know. She just has such a warm heart, loves animals. I really have to just, like I could probably just stack up different Disney princesses and compare her to them. Like, she loves books like Belle. She loves wolves like Lori Griffin from Teen Wolf. Griffin. You said it was Griffin.
Sure.
No, she loves books like Belle. She's adventurous like Jasmine. She's curious like Ariel. Like, seriously, like, she is like I did marry the ultimate Disney princess. She loves animals like, what's her name? Aurora from Sleeping Beauty.
Dude, that is an amazing answer, honestly.
Mhm.
Because yeah, when I didn't get to talk to her too much, we were busy, and one of the things that I really I'm one of those individuals that if someone has their significant other around, I tend to go out of my way to be like, "I'm going to talk to the significant other because I
Yeah,
think
yeah, yeah, because they feel left out.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly, exactly.
happens all the time.
Can I ask a question and then about what were the early movies that you guys maybe bonded over when you first started dating each other?
Oh, that's a great question. Let me try to remember because we met at a summer camp where you worked like 14-hour days. So there wasn't much time to watch movies at the end of the day. Um, I'll tell you a very early movie we saw together. She loves penguins, my wife, and we went to go see when I visited her a few months later after the camp ended in Scotland. I remember us going to see two movies that made a big impression on us. One was the new Muppet movie because you know that song in it, I've got everything that I
Is this
need.
the
That's how
one
we
with
felt about
Jason Segel,
Jason
that one?
Segel, yeah.
Yeah.
That's how we felt about each other, like, that song was very much apt whenever we were around each other,
Oh, that's
and the
cute.
other one was Happy Feet 2, which I think is the better Happy Feet movie. It's like, it's like George Miller just made a movie for me. I think George Miller did that one.
Hmm.
He
Yeah,
produced
yeah,
both of them.
that was the one he did.
Yeah, and then, I remember her like, there's a part where that little penguin is, like, huddled and everybody's made fun of him, and she just leaned to me and went, "I'm going to explode," because it was so adorable, and so we've always, like, loved those movies too. Um, and also just from working at a summer camp, I made everybody watch Wet Hot American Summer as many times as possible. I love that
Okay.
movie. So I wouldn't say that we bonded over that, but I remember that was an early one that we watched together. We might have watched Kiss Kiss Bang Bang. That might be the first one we watched together. I remember around that time seeing it for the first time, but I'm not sure.
There's I think for guys like you and I, when it comes to the shared connect especially for I have a significant other who's not in the industry like us at all or has any aspirations whatsoever to be part of the industry.
Mhm.
So, finding those connective threads with film, I feel like is kind of integral in a relationship for us, and what I loved about your answers in particular is everyone knows you as part of, like, the nerddom, the geekdom, right? And you did not provide, like, the thing that you bonded over your wife with, which I'm sure you guys have probably bonded over some, like
Oh, no, she loves
yeah.
Star Trek. She loves
Yeah.
watching Marvel movies. Huge Twilight fan. I think you can count that in there too. Yeah, she's got a lot. I mean, the certain Marvel things she likes a lot, but there's other Star Wars things she hasn't seen yet.
But I like the plethora that you provided. So I'm hopping all over the place here because it's my challenge of the short limited runtime here. I'm like, what are everything I have never asked Ryan Arey in
Mhm.
person before? So when you were a
Well, you
kid
keep making me feel guilty. I
I
thought
know
it would
that's
be
what
an hour, and I was like, "Oh, okay." So
I
I
just wanted
budgeted time for an hour, and I didn't pay attention to your messages when you explained the podcast because I
yeah,
didn't
it
care because I
happens.
was going to show up and be here for you no matter what. So I don't know, like
That's what the
I'm
friends
a
do, man.
people pleaser. That's part of what they've diagnosed me in therapy with, like people pleasing and ADHD. So the people pleasing thing, like I feel horribly guilty if I don't give my all, but then I don't give enough to anybody. That's kind of the time constraints I always find myself in.
The other character I identify the most with, I've been rewatching the show again lately. In terms of a character
Mhm.
is because of what you just said, it reminded me of, like, who I identify the most with, and that is Chandler from Friends, undoubtedly.
Yeah,
I
when
don't
I was
even
a
know if
kid, yeah.
I don't
When I
even know
was
if
in
it was,
high
like, the
he
or
was the one
worse.
on Friends who I identify with. Like, Raphael was the Ninja Turtle I identified with when I was a kid because I
He's the
wanted
one
to
you
be the class clown.
okay, so was Raphael the Ninja Turtle you identified with or the character you wanted to be?
One and the same. I think, when I was a kid, I especially had a class clown view of myself. Like, I was a pretty funny kid. I did voices, stuff like that. Loved watching stand-up comedy, watch stand-up comedy routines and then come do them in front of my class. So I was gravitated toward performance and sketch and stand-up. Um, yeah, like anytime somebody had like we had Showtime and I would try to VCR, like tape any comedian thing that came on there. Didn't get a lot of the jokes. Like I didn't know what an enema was, and that was pretty like this one guy compared it to a water slide. And I, you know, did the joke in front of my class and my teacher didn't let on what an enema was. So there you go. It was like in
Oh, that's
5th grade,
funny.
I think. Yeah.
So, which character would you say that you most identify with, whether it be TV show or movie? Maybe even in your present time?
I'm sure this is a cliche answer, but it probably is Luke Skywalker. And I'll tell you, I can tell you exactly why, though.
Okay.
I grew up in a small town. And when it's funny when you watch these things, like I do think that a big part of the appeal for Superman and Luke Skywalker for me, which are my two favorites. Um,
You're an only
Same thing
child,
that,
really quick? Sorry,
huh?
real quick. You're an only child?
No, I have brother and sister.
You have a brother and sister?
Um,
Okay.
yeah, I'm the youngest. Those characters, they grew up in the country and then they went off and did big things. And it's a standard like orphan boy, farmer, farm kid kind of fairy tale arc. I know that,
Mhm.
but it works for a reason. So with Luke Skywalker, I always identified with that, like this bored life and feeling like you weren't going to go anywhere and there was no adventure. And, you know, it's a good that, in the original cut of A New Hope, it had Luke and his friends and all this kind of stuff. I think it's good that they cut all that because it showed Luke
Mm.
as somebody who was very alone. And when I was a kid, I'm the youngest of three. My sister's
Mhm.
8 years older than me. My brother's 6 years older than me. So there was a pretty
Mhm.
sizable
Big
gap
gap.
there.
Yeah.
And I had a great brother and sister. Looked up to them and still do to this day. But they were teenagers when I was, an 8. So they were always off doing other things or in the room with the door shut, and their friends were in there. So I always felt left out. So I remember like Kermit's song, "It's Not Easy Being Green," like this kind of melancholy. I like identified with that as a kid. I always felt really lonely as a kid. So Luke Skywalker has that aspect as well, and so does Superman, where he really can never truly connect with anyone, even with Lois, until he reveals his secret identity in the comics. But even then, there's always going to be a fundamental difference between them. So with Luke, he goes off, he has his adventures, the literally book by book hero's journey, the confrontation with the dad and all that
Mhm.
stuff,
Mhm. Mhm.
which I didn't necessarily relate to. But then the fact that like Luke's main opponent in those movies isn't the Empire, it's himself. It's his own impatience, his own rage,
Mm.
his own lack of, I guess, emotional intelligence. And I think as an adolescent, you can very much relate to that character. And there's a certain point in adolescence when you realize that institutions aren't solid, that things don't matter like you thought they did. So the moment when he finds out that Darth Vader is his dad, yeah, sure, it's about George Lucas and his dad, but it's also about kids learning, like from Watergate and stuff like that, that the system doesn't work for them. And I think individually, we all have that moment at some point in our lives. And honestly, in Last Jedi, I think that painted a portrait that's pretty accurate of what it's like when you get older. We all start off with certain ideals about the world, or you think that government works this way or that way. And then eventually, like Mark Hamill even said, his generation was supposed to be the one that would change things, and they're the ones who elected Trump. Like there's something to that that is unpleasant to look at, but is extremely accurate. And as somebody who's now in his 40s, I I I see it, I do understand that, like, you do get older. People who are your age start to die, or people who you never thought would die, or people who you used to look up to reveal themselves to be horrible people. Like, the world changes and you're changing with it. And The Last Jedi, you see that from Luke. So I continue to kind of identify with that character, even at points when you wouldn't want to.
That is awesome because I've heard people say before, maybe not directly here, but just with talking with people or hearing other people talk, they usually say, "Yeah, I've heard the answer, Luke Skywalker." So when you say cliche, sure, but the depth that you gave behind it, I was like, "Oh, this is more than just some admiration or aspiration quality." The fact that it's extended into your present day life,
Mhm.
even to the portion of Luke Skywalker that is very much a divide when it comes to audiences, I
Well,
actually find very compelling.
I don't think Luke is somebody you would look up to. I mean, he ends up doing the right thing in Return of the Jedi, but
Mm.
it's easy to gloss over exactly how far he was falling, right? At that moment when he was really giving into rage. Superman is somebody you look up to because I got a great book here about Superman. I forget what it's called, but I think it's called The Unauthorized Biography. And with Superman, this book lays down 2 fundamental rules about him.
Mhm.
1, he always does the right thing. 2, he never gives up.
Okay.
So those are 2 things that is something to look up to. I think you can look up to that.
Would you say that you have adopted anything from Superman or Luke Skywalker or perhaps a different character where you actually adopted a type of philosophy or a point of view or were inspired to go down that path based off of a character?
A character,
Like, did a movie do it for
prob
you in some way?
probably more Mr. Rogers. I think that,
Oh, okay, cool.
Ted Lasso's doing it right now, but before Ted Lasso, we had Fred Rogers. This guy who, just approached the world with kindness, at any cost, like, no matter what, his default setting was always kindness. And when I say Mr. Rogers, I know there's a documentary about Fred Rogers, but I mean
Mhm,
the character Mr. Rogers.
mhm.
I think I always try to think, and I don't ever succeed, but I always try to think like, okay, so how would I want to be treated in this situation? What's the right way? And deal with it that way. Now, that being said, sometimes when you're dealing with people, like especially a boss or a bully, or as a boss, or dealing with a bully or something, you can't be kind and you have to be stern. And
Sure.
then, people respect you for that. Doesn't happen very often, but it's very true.
I actually didn't grow up on Mister Rogers. I was late to the clips
You
of
missed
Mister
out.
Rogers.
I think that's a big problem with the internet generation. Like, a
Mm,
lot of these
mm.
kids didn't grow up with a kindly old minister sitting down and playing with action figures with them for 30 minutes a day.
Yeah, the documentary I saw that you were referencing and
Mhm.
just bawling the entire time. Like,
I
I
started it and cried a good bit in the beginning, but I didn't make it all the way through yet. The Superman
okay.
documentary, I'm pumped to see. I haven't had a chance yet.
But yeah, when it came to Mister Rogers, I actually see 'cause I found myself, wanting to follow that influence a little bit more, and I tend to be very curious about that. I tend to ask, like, guys this question because it's something that I feel we should be able to talk a little bit more about. Um, what is the kind of thing in a movie that tends to make you cry the most? For me, I notice it's kinda like the actions of belief and love. So that's why something like a Mister Rogers breaks me every time.
Mhm. Sacrifice, usually gets me. Like, I remember being a
Mm.
teenager and rewatching The Brave Little Toaster, and the moment when he, jumps into the gears. I don't know if you've seen The Brave Little Toaster. It's about sentient appliances who are trying to find their owner, because 'cause they'd been left
Aw.
alone in a house for 20 years. And so they find this kid, and then the kid's gonna die at this junkyard, like, it's, Disney movie, so it's kind of weird how it ends. Is it a Disney movie? I think it is. But it's, like, straight to TV, like Disney Channel movie. And then, yeah, the brave little toaster leaps down and, like, dives in these gears, and, it's like as brutal as seeing dead ET in ET, right? And yeah, that I remember watching that as a kid and crying. It's interesting though, because usually when you cry, I think crying's amazing. I think crying is like this, like I live in New York City, so they put these steam columns up to relieve pressure all the time in the streets. That's what crying is for the human brain, crying and laughing. They're the same part of the brain. That's why they kind of look the same sometimes, and you can't tell which is which. So they're both release valves. One is the ultimate expression of joy, and the other is the ultimate expression of sorrow. Um, but with crying, for me, it's always been this tension release valve. So you're always crying at something. So for instance, my favorite book is
Mm.
Charlotte's Web, right?
Interesting,
At the end
interesting.
of Charlotte's Web, Charlotte essentially sacrifices her life for Wilbur the pig. Like, she spins a web until she can't anymore, and she gives him this lovely speech at the end about how he's going to go on and he's going to do things and he's going to see the spring and see the seasons change, and that makes her happy. So, just for me, I think it's sacrifice. It's somebody giving all of themselves to someone else simply because it's the right thing to do.
Wow, that is a beautiful answer. What is it about sacrifice that's particularly hits you? Because some people will get hit most by like, I don't weirdly it depends on the situation usually, but I don't really get hit too much if a character dies. Like, I didn't really cry when, like, the first time I saw Endgame, I actually didn't cry.
Nah, me neither.
Even though it is a sacrifice moment, maybe it's the way I edit it or whatever, but normally, like, a death doesn't really get me.
Well, it was such a badass death, you know what I mean? Like,
Sure,
I
sure,
think a
sure.
death like, God, I mean, there are just so many deaths in movies that just like Ned Stark's death, it didn't make me cry either, but, like, it just sucks to see that
Yeah.
happen, like, it's a
Mhm.
real heartbreaker. Also, like, his death wasn't set up as a tragedy, it's set up as a triumph, and I think the really heartbreaking deaths are the ones where,
Mm.
life is cut short, for example. Like, you could pick a random episode of 6 Feet Under and watch the intro and get more emotional from that, I think, than you would a death like that, or like Superman's death and Batman versus Superman. There's very little stakes because we always know they could come back. For me, it was more like Robert Downey Jr. is not going to be in these movies anymore because I know Iron Man continues. That being said, though, when Superman died in the comics in '93, I had a like, when I heard there was gonna be a new villain called Doomsday who was gonna kill Superman, like, comics are fictional, but I always sort of thought of comics as a story that was happening, but just, like, over there where Lori Griffin is at right now. The stories that are happening somewhere or that they're reporting on them, like, it's a saga that's being reported on. So, for me, hearing, "Oh, man, Superman's gonna die," I was, like, 12 or 13 at the time, was a big deal. I had dreams of about Doomsday. Like, I was in a city by myself, and Doomsday was chasing me, and nobody could save me. And
Mhm.
then I read a letter in a comic book, like in the they used to put letters pages in, I think they still do. Um, and somebody had had the same dream. And it's interesting that, like, a lot of the things that we think are so like, everybody there's billions of people on the planet, somebody else is going through that same thing. Um, so, yeah, as far as what the impetus for me to cry at certain things, I guess, or what it is about sacrifice, I didn't cry when I read that comic, which was Superman sacrificing himself. Maybe it comes back to a religious aspect. Because like Christ on the cross, things like that. Um, because, I'm not saying I kind of was raised in church. My mom wanted us to choose for ourselves, and then I
Mm.
got pretty into church when I was in high school. But that being said, I was always really analytical about it. Like I always thought, why don't you guys like gay people? And who cares? Like they're born that way. Like I always
Mm.
had that thought, even in like my country church. I never got like brainwashed by the dogma. But you know, the death of Jesus was a true sacrifice and that he could have done so much more. Like
Yeah.
had he lived, he could have done this and that, but that's not what was important. The important part was dying. I've never really the whole like dying for our sins and a metaphysical change like in heaven, I never really thought that was the point. I thought the point
Sure.
was just an example of showing sacrifice to others. So maybe that's part of it. It's the wasted potential of it. I had an uncle once who died of alcoholism, and that's still heartbreaking when I think about it. I had a brother-in-law who passed away in a car accident. There's certain things like that. I guess I'm trying to work through what it is in these movies that really hits me. I think overall it's the tragedy of it. It's like a life cut short. But the idea of sacrifice is it comes back to, well, it's not sacrificial if you have nothing to give up. Like if you're somebody who like the whole, "I don't have a wife and kids, I'll save you." You know what I mean? Like, that doesn't mean as much as somebody saving themselves for their child, or
Yeah.
somebody a toaster who spent the entire movie looking for their master and they find him, and then
Mm.
it's more important for him to save him than it is for him to continue living on himself?
I gotta say, the start of this, I was like, "Okay, maybe this will be the biggest joke-heavy podcast we've done." And this is
I can do
think
that. I can be
I
insincere if you want.
please, for the love of God, Ryan, no. Let's keep it sincere.
Instead,
Uh,
let's talk religion, politics,
I love seeing this side of you because
Lori Griffith.
I feel like in your videos, we get, these doses where you can see a lot of the great I would say the appreciation of the text, actually. I've noticed, like, the way you articulate, the way you use vocabulary, it's very obvious you are a well-spoken, well-read individual. Actually, to that fact, what was the books that you actually grew up on? Because you are an you author, don't you?
I have written a book, it's not published.
Okay.
I've written, a couple little things too, but, who were my guys? I read a lot of Stephen King when I was a teenager. I had a teacher who gave us a Stephen King book to read called Eyes of the Dragon, and I got bit by the bug. When I was a little kid, I loved Peanuts, loved comics, just devoured comics. Still do to this day. In fact, right now, that's pretty much what I read. I also got super into Star Wars novels, and to this day, I'm usually recreationally find myself just reading things for work, trying to get caught up on the High Republic. I just reread for fun a comic series called Preacher by Garth
Yeah.
Ennis and Steve
Yeah, it's
Dillon.
a
I
good
read it
one.
through a couple of times. It's amazing. I just wondered how it held up, and it held up amazingly. And other authors that really spoke to me. My favorite book is Charlotte's Web, like I said, and then before the movie even came out, Queen's Gambit's one of the best books I've ever read. I love
Mm.
Walter Tevis. He's one of my favorite authors. And he wrote another book called Mockingbird that I think is gonna be adapted soon, and it's gonna be a great one if they do it right. Because that book especially, it's about a future where people don't read. They don't have to read because everything's pictures, and they have buses that just take you everywhere, and the human race is slowly dying out, but then one teacher teaches himself how to read, and it starts this whole journey of self-discovery and stuff. It's a great book.
What a
Um,
meta book. You're reading you're reading text about how people aren't reading. That's so fascinating to me.
yeah, and I think it was partially written. I mean, look, the author Walter Tevis, there's a documentary about him on PBS. He's just a really interesting guy. But he's an Ohio boy like me who actually grew up near each other, and so there's like that connection too. Yeah, man. Like, oh God, I've read a lot of books. I'm trying to think like my go-tos. I didn't super get into sci-fi until later. I read a lot of alternate history,
Mm.
and then I happened to read a short story collection. I was a nerd who, like, would just take the books off the shelf in the teachers' classrooms at the end of the summer and say, or at the beginning of the summer and say, "Can I borrow this?" Um, and then I got into Asimov, and I read, like, The Foundation and all
Hmm.
that stuff.
In
I
Ohio, do you have a community when you were growing up, did you have, like, a community of nerd friends or geek friends or film friends at all, or were
uh,
you kind of a little bit isolated?
I was isolated. I had one really good friend who read comics. That we had, like, another guy or 2 in my class, but this guy's still my best friend to this day. We always tried to get to Comic-Con. One year we were gonna go in 1999. We ended up not going, because a buddy of ours, like, his fiancée had just left him. She just left him because he was going to the strip club too much. So instead of going to Chicago to Wizard World, we went to go visit him, and then he took us to the strip club. And, that was my first and that was my first and half the times I've ever been to a strip club. And I remember, like, we're the guys who don't drink. I think we were 19 and had no money to
Mm,
spend on anything and wouldn't have spent. In fact,
sure.
and then the oldest stripper in the place came up to me and just chatted, and she's like, "So can I have a tip?" And I was like, "I don't have any." I was like, "I just got a 10." And she pulled out a purse and said, "I can make change." So I was like making change with this older stripper for for making small talk. It was a very surreal experience. So, yeah, I had one friend who I was, like, really into that stuff. I had, like, a small core group of friends. I had another friend who didn't necessarily read comics, but loved Star Wars, and he was the first person I knew who had the internet. His family had web TV.
Cool.
So I remember going to his house and, like, us, like, looking up Star Wars news on web TV because the prequels were getting made and looking up rumors and stuff. Very, very proto to what I do now. And then when I got into school, I had, of course, had friends who were super into film, who, like, introduced me to sites like Ain't It Cool and stuff
Sure.
like that. Um Got more into the film appreciation side, but, especially my senior year, I really hit my stride. Like, we grabbed a camera, I wrote a screenplay, made a film with my friends, and, a lot of us are still friends to this day.
That's cool.
Yeah.
I'm curious then, when it comes to growing up a little bit more on the isolated side, granted you have, like, a close friend, and now you are essentially like the online leader presence of a big company that is a representative of such a big fandom. There's so many voices involved. Has that lonely side ever has that been filled, you think? That void of not really having that community, or has that community now been filled with it? Or do you still feel like there's a bit of a distance
No,
considering
it's
that it's
it's
online?
it's online. No, it's pretty lonely. I mean, I don't have time usually to read comments. I love going on the ScreenCrush Discord server. It is so much fun. But it's pretty rare that I do that. I have tendonitis in my thumb, so I can't do shit on my phone. So it has to be like on a keyboard. And
Mm,
normally when I'm done with work, it's time to walk Doug. It's time to do things around the house, put Christmas decorations. So I do feel a lot there. But when we do our live shows, my favorite thing about the live show is just talking to people. Like we had one person who came up to me at one of the shows after he was in the meet and greet line, and then he stuck around, him and his wife, and I could tell he wanted to say something, and then he just came out, he's like, and he kind of, I'm not gonna say what he said, but it was very emotional and talked about how much the channel meant, and I just gave him the biggest hug.
mm,
Uh, and it was really cool, hearing that kind of thing
it's
because
beautiful.
I could show you the room where we film in. It's a small room, there's a camera, and, it's very isolated. I mean, post-COVID, we don't have an office. It's just, an extra room. So, no, I still feel that isolation, but I know that there's a lot of people out there I can always go on the internet and talk to, but, like, the physical isolation, that's why I like doing the live shows and, Comic-Con, things like that.
When you were talking earlier about this trajectory of really identifying with Luke Skywalker to where he is by the point of, like, The Last Jedi, have you found that with fandom? Because you have a certain kind of image. I imagine you have a certain kind of perspective of these comic book properties, these fandoms, these worlds, this lore, and then when you get into it with the job that you have now, is that would you identify in that regard of like, "Oh, this is not how I thought it would be? Like, what would you tell your younger self about like how the Star Wars fandom is now, or do you have the same type of gusto and appreciation for it?
I don't really let I mean, I don't pay attention to it, man. Like, as far as, like, negative fandom and on Star Wars especially, I just know there's certain people who have worked out a profit model to make up their mind before anything ever happens, and I guess a lot of people identify with them, and so they go to get hit to spend time in their echo chamber. Boys have been doing that forever. I mean, it's the same thing as a bowling league. I don't care. Like, I really don't. I got asked this question at the live show the other day, and I was like, I just don't. There's no point in having conflict with them because their mind's made up. They don't care about discourse. They care about engagement. And I think that's just, if you could like personify the internet into a thing that's wrong with it, it's that aspect of Star Wars fandom. But Star Wars fandom's always going to be like that because it's always going to be personal. The MCU will never be as personal to people. Star Wars is personal because of the toys. It's personal because of the gaps. It's personal because so much of it was left intentionally vague and not filled in, right? So we were invited to fill those gaps in ourselves and to take it personally because we saw it as children. The Marvel Cinematic Universe, however, is an adaptation of stories that have already existed. So the way that somebody feels about, say, T'Challa through Chadwick Boseman's performance is completely different from how I feel about T'Challa as somebody who read the Christopher Priest comics in college. You know what I mean? So that for me is never going to quite. I mean, you've even seen it. Look how fast people have abandoned the MCU, right? I don't think people would wholesale abandon Star Wars like that. If the prequels couldn't do it, I don't know what could, you know what I mean? Like, they may not watch Skeleton Crew right away, but they're always gonna love Star Wars. Star Wars, though, I think is becoming more like the WWE, where WWE fans love wrestling, but they hate the WWE. They are proud to root for cheer against Vince McMahon and hate him in the same way that a lot of Star Wars fans rail on Disney Star Wars, when
That's
in
a perfect
fact,
analogy. Yeah, that's a
Disney
perfect
Star
analogy. Yeah,
Wars didn't
yeah,
really I mean, when we talk about Disney Star Wars, right? There's Lucasfilm and then there's Disney. Lucasfilm, I'm way off topic here. Lucasfilm are people who love Star Wars and know what they're doing.
yeah.
Disney are people who say, we'll put Chewbacca in it. We want it to be more like the original trilogy. We need to bump up Disney Plus, make that Obi-Wan thing. Like, those are the people who canceled the Acolyte before it should have been canceled, you know? Who like
Sure.
don't see stories, they see balance sheets.
Mm.
So yeah, no, I wouldn't change anything. I'd say, go on this journey yourself, young man, and discover how awful fans are.
That's actually a beautiful answer. That's actually very profound. I really appreciate that a lot. Earlier, you listed I don't really have like as an interviewer, I've noticed because my mind, I'm diagnosed with ADHD as well, and my mind just kind of zigzags to like, oh, I just remember this. So I
Hey,
notice
can
a
I
lot.
say something? For
Yeah.
somebody with ADHD, you do a great job of listening, because a lot of the time when I'm
Mm,
listening to people, it's not that I think they're boring, it's because 'cause I've worked out what they're gonna say already, and I
mm.
can't be bothered to like, a slow talker for me where I'm like, "I have worked this shit out 5 minutes ago. Could you please" it's not that I wanna talk even, it's just that I wanna do anything else right now except rewatch this movie I've seen play out in my head several times. So, for me, I've had to struggle with not finishing people's sentences for them. Like, it's a great thing about being married because I think I've got it, and I don't want them to waste time finishing their sentence when they can move on to the next thought. You know, it's almost like you wanna be like there's a species in Star Trek that are binary, like, that's 2 people with the same mind. That's almost like how I wish everybody would talk to me. So yeah, you're doing great.
It's just so real, and I completely know where you're coming.
Yeah,
Just never heard it pointed out like that. Thank you for
yeah.
that. I'm gonna need that. I needed
That's
that.
probably
I
where the
haven't.
loneliness comes from too. There's probably a bit of narcissistic disorder in there too, like, that's tied into ADHD.
It can
And the thing
happen.
yeah, the thing about narcissistic disorder is, I don't think I have it, but I think if you have ADHD, you automatically have a touch of it. Um, Everybody's like, "Oh, narcissists are assholes," and don't get me wrong, they are. But it's not like they want to be like that. Like, you gotta think of it like you're in a prison and your mind like, this is a prison, and you have to
Yeah.
really struggle to see somebody. So I even feel for the narcissist when it comes to that kind of thing.
Well, what I'm enjoying about this talk with you right now, if I'm gonna step out of it, I was listening to this talk the other day that really stood out to me. This one little section that was talking about what charisma is often encapsulated in. And a lot of people, when they hear charisma, some people have their own definition of what it can mean, right? It could be, yeah, you're just smiling, you're charming, whatever. But
Mhm.
they broke it down into two categories, which was called competence and warmth. And usually most charismatic people tend to have a solid hybrid of both. And what I'm really loving about this discussion with you is I feel like on ScreenCrush, it's not like you're not warm. You just primarily display your competence. And I feel like we've gotten a lot of your warmth in this particular talk.
Also, I should probably be warmer on ScreenCrush is what I'm
I
hearing,
should be
and then
warmer on real
yeah,
rechecks,
exactly.
honestly. Yeah,
Yeah, that's what we're
no,
getting. No, I do struggle, like, 'cause, I'm usually reading from a script, right? So
sure,
it is
sure.
hard sometimes, especially if I didn't write the script, to come across, like, people like Charlie Schneider. I don't think Charlie scripts anything. I think I've never asked him actually.
Emergency awesome, right?
Yeah, Emergency
Yeah.
Awesome.
Mhm.
Love him. Um, I think it seems to me like he reads off an outline. So he's very much, like, confident and goes through and I could probably do that, but it'd be harder to edit.
Sure.
So it is hard sometimes to just kind of sit down in a conversational way, and do this. Because also it rambles, you'll go here and it's not as tight, and sometimes you just want that tight 15-minute take on Skeleton Crew.
Yeah, especially when you have to deal with editing and watch time and all that, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Who were there is a performative aspect to you, though, where there's obviously a lot of the writing and intellectual side comes out of you. Who were, like, the performers that you were inspired by? You even talked earlier about being, like, inspired by stand-up comedians. You've done stand-up comedy. Was there a particular performer who you're like, "Ooh,
Uh,
I really vibe with this guy. I
when
wanna
I
be
was a
like him."
kid, Eddie Murphy, because he did the voices and stuff, I just thought he was
Oh,
hilarious.
okay.
Later on, Steve Martin, and then I watched an Andy Kaufman special, in 1997 that just changed me. Like, that was, like, seeing how somebody could do something so weird, but it made me laugh, and I got that everybody wouldn't get it. And then when I did stand-up, he was my primary, influence because my whole thing was, "If you're not laughing, you're wrong." And it was right. It was not a good opinion for comedy, but it did influence a lot of the bits that I created. So I would say he was definitely a performer for me. Um, Early days of, like, interest in stand-up, and then the
Mhm,
kids in the hall as far as being a sketch writer, I think I like their stuff more than anyone else's.
mm.
I would say they're very much like Key and Peele. I've never heard Key and Peele mention Kids in the Hall, but I think that their sketches, they all kinda have the same surrealist aspect to it,
Fascinating.
where yeah, I would compare the 2. I mean, not every Kids in the Hall sketch, I didn't love everything they did, but a lot of it aged. It was the '80s. Um, Other performers that influenced me, Paul from Heavy Spoilers, of course,
Of course.
great influence. As far as in the YouTube space, I mean, I've watched a million film videos. Shout out New Rock Stars and shout out Charlie and,
Mm.
Mr. Sunday Movies,
Yeah.
and, I remember watching Philip Molina's breakdown of, Force Awakens, which I couldn't find the other day actually, when I was looking for it, but that too, I was like, "Wow, there's so much depth in this," and God, so many other channels don't even Belated Media, like, there's so many great ones out there. Patrick Willems, like, I was a fan of Patrick's before I met him and did this stuff professionally. So, a lot of that, like, you kind of take aspects of what other people do and you use it for it's like handwriting, you copy it exactly, and then you develop your own style and bring a talking dog onto the show and stuff like that.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Were your parents at all into did you bond with them with
Yeah.
movies or shows?
Oh, yeah, yeah,
Oh,
yeah, yeah, whole family, yeah, we loved movies. Um, my dad, like, that's the one thing we 'cause I wasn't as into sports as he was. My dad and I really bonded over movies. Like, when he would pick me up, my parents divorced. When he would pick me up for the weekend, the first place we would go when we got to the town where he lived was go to the video store, like, stacks of
cool,
movies all weekend.
cool.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. My mom too, like, my mom is the one who got me into Star Trek and Star Wars and loved sci-fi
No
and,
way, she was like the nerd.
yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, she loved Batman when she was a kid. My brother was the one who collected my brother had a variety of interests, still does. Everything from he was mostly an athlete, but he loved theater, like Broadway shows. He loved, baseball cards, he collected those, but he also collected comics and, and video games, that was always part of it too. So yeah, and then my sister is like the movie person. Her favorite movie is The Goonies. She and my mom actually took a road trip to Astoria, Oregon, and went to where they shot it. She's a producer, some kind of producer. She donated money to a Goonies documentary. Like, that's how
Cool.
enthusiastic she is about it. But she's always been the person who, like, she worked in a video store. I never actually worked in a video store. My sister did. I worked in a movie theater for a little bit. Yeah, no, whole family, great, great, great love of movies.
Is there a particular film that you would say that when you watch it, you immediately think of your parents or one of them?
Oh, that's a really good question. The Planes, Trains, and Automobiles is tied to a pretty specific memory because I remember us renting that on VHS, but also renting the VCR.
You rented a VC you could rent a VCR back
Yeah, you
then?
had to, and they were too
Oh.
expensive, back in the day, so you could rent them from the library, but they were hard to get a hold of, but then they would come in, like, suitcases, where, like, the suitcase was the casing for it with the handle
Mm,
and stuff. But I remember watching that with the family. If you want, I'll give you a good childhood, memory of a movie, though. It's got nothing to do with my parents, but, I remember my brother and sister, like I said, they were older, they would usually have people sleep over, which is funny because we lived in a two-bedroom trailer. So one time I remember they had all these other kids over, it might have not been that many, but it feels like a lot, and we were watching Stand By Me,
okay.
and this hasn't happened very many times. I think it's maybe happened one other time in my life. I watched the movie, and then when it was over, I looked around and everyone was asleep, and I never noticed. Like, I was able to hyper it's ADHD. I was able to hyper focus on the
Mm.
movie so much, and I wish I still had that ability. Like, it's so rare for me to find anything where it was literally like time travel. So that was another great movie that we all, like, bonded over and associated with.
Do you think your perspective of society and the world wasn't because you obviously read a lot, but do you feel like movies and shows perhaps expanded your perspective of culture outside of where you grew up?
Yeah, yeah, it was the escape for sure. Like, it goes back to the escapism of, the country boy, like Luke Skywalker looking at the I mean, I have a model, it's up there, but I my favorite moment in Star Wars is Luke looking at the binary sunset. I think that expresses that moment is why Star Wars is personal to people, because it's not a guy who's shooting lasers and stuff like that. It's a kid with a dream, and that's when we kind of, like we imprinted on Luke in that moment, like Jacob imprinting on baby Nessa and Twilight. That's I wish I wouldn't have fumbled that, but that's a very good analogy. So yeah, that in particular was something that I always there were always escapism for me. I remember like yeah, it's so weird to live in New York City and to grow up seeing New York City in movies, and I remember like how far away it felt. The first time you
Oh,
come here as a kid, I was 19, but I was still like first time you see the ocean, 'cause I also didn't see the ocean until I was a teenager. It's so mind-boggling that you're seeing it and how in some ways smaller, in some ways bigger, than you ever thought it could be.
yeah.
So yeah, definitely escapism was always a big part of, movies and TV shows for me.
I definitely have that with you when it comes to New York. Like, I'm actually gonna go there in a couple weeks.
See oh, no,
Um,
I won't be here.
and I'm going with my wife. She's never been.
I would wish I was here. Damn it.
I wish you were everyone I know who lives in New York is not gonna be in New York when I'm in New York every single time, yeah.
I could give you some recommendations though if you want, like, I could probably think of a couple things worth doing.
I love it. The thing you said earlier was Stephen King. Yeah, you read his books growing up, but I don't really hear you talk too much about horror in your work.
Well, I don't I never like, I know Stephen King is known as a horror writer, but that's not why I read his books. I mean, his books are also very fantasy and science fiction, like,
Hmm.
Needful Things, well, that's The Stand, right? I mean, I've read that book 3 times. It's not a horror book. It's mystical, it's magical, but it's about people.
But do you like horror?
Yeah, 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 I do. I'm not a big expert in it. We do have one writer on the channel, Brianna McLarty, who is a massive horror fan, and I really want us to start doing it because now, like, we've got this script she's got. I don't think she's written it yet, but it's about, this kind of mini renaissance horror is in right now. And I don't see a lot of movies, man. You'd be surprised, like, the shockingly small amount of movies I actually get to see. Like, when Oscar season starts, I'll really try to go all in and see as much stuff as possible, but I still haven't seen Wild Robot, haven't seen Gladiator 2, haven't seen Alien Romulus. It's ridiculous how little time I have.
But I imagine a lot gets spoiled for you.
Yes and no. I mean, I even if I record a video on something, it doesn't mean that I'm necessarily gonna retain everything that I say. You can tell you mentioned the
That's
videos
true.
as are performative, and yeah, you've read from a teleprompter. It really is like Ron Burgundy,
Yeah,
"Go
it
fuck
really
yourself,
is.
San Diego." Like, you could probably put a lot of things in front of me like that, like or the number of times I have just blown through Japanese names and hoped I got it right, knowing I'd come back and do a pickup, like that kind of thing too. But pronunciation, I mean.
I love hearing these aspects again because as long as we've known each other, there's so much about you. I didn't even know that you had a brother and sister until this
Mhm.
conversation. So like there's still so much. I'm like, oh man, there's so many things I still haven't like asked you about. So it's fun, like, tying it into movies and uncovering this piece of information here that there's certain questions I'm like, "Oh, I would love to hear Ryan's answer on this because I love the introspection that you actually bring to it." What would you say is the last movie that you watched that you just could not stop thinking about it after you watched it? I thought for me this year might be Furiosa. It didn't quite gestate as long as I hoped it would. The Dark Knight is a great example of, like, one that I just thought about and still think about to this day.
Not a movie, but I think about the Watchmen TV series all the time.
Really? Why?
Yeah, I just layered. I mean, there's so much to that. I think not just about our culture and racism, and politics, but also just about the nature of superhero stories. Like, even just the idea that in that universe, the cops wear a mask really made me say, gee, what does it mean to wear a mask? Like when superheroes wear a mask, yeah, since the 40s or 30s, it's had a really practical application so they can have two lives to protect their
Mhm.
loved ones,
Protect
right?
other identity. Yeah.
Exactly. The Punisher has no loved ones, so he wears no mask.
Mhm.
Superman, Clark Kent's the mask, which I don't actually isn't really true anymore, but it used to be. Um, in The Watchmen, when the cops wear a mask, it's for the same reason. It's granting them anonymity so their loved ones don't get attacked. But then you also think it removes accountability. And they're really careful in the first scene in that to show that there are a lot of procedures. It's a very liberal government. There are a lot of procedures if you even want to pull a gun on a traffic stop. But on the other hand, they're also able to go into a trailer park and beat the hell out of people who are neo-Nazis. Then there's a line that Adrian Veidt has in it where he says, "Masks make men cruel," because of that anonymity that it grants you. And I think that speaks to accountability in the sense of being a part of a community. Like if you
Mm.
want to
Mm.
be accepted by people, you will obey certain societal norms. You will, and everybody's got different levels of that. I'm the kind of person who not only returns my shopping cart, but I'll pick up strays along the way. Not everybody's like that, and I've come to accept that. That's a big part of counseling. I think that in terms of wearing a mask, it also gives you permission to be beyond those norms. In the same way that you could say being a public official or a politician or wearing a badge could make the worst of us have those same impulses, and that's what the Watchman was really getting at in that last monologue. It's just brilliant.
Mm.
And then, like, her great-grandfather has this line where he says, "You can't heal without sunlight. You can't heal under a mask." And then you get into the whole idea of, like, well, as a society, you can say that, like, post Watergate and Vietnam War, Jimmy Carter was a president who was really trying to be honest with people and say, "Hey, this is hard. Conservation's important. We have to conserve energy." And then in the '80s, Reagan came along and was very much like, "You're Americans. You're the best. Don't worry about any of that stuff." And we always
Mm.
prefer to wear the mask. We always prefer to put on this idea of the person we want to be rather than maybe doing the work about who we actually are and figuring out how to fix ourselves, both as a nation and as an individual.
That's a really strong point. Really strong point. The idea of a mask in, I mean, I think of, like, the mask, like, we all wear masks, but the idea of actually wearing a mask everywhere we go, even when it comes to being presenting ourselves here, like, on camera, we're gonna be doing a talk. Like, before we were doing this, I was having undoubtedly one of the most stressed out days I've had in a very long time. I had a thing where I was, like, sending a voice message to one of the teams here, and I was pissed, and I was like, "Don't send." Like, I was sending a voice, I was like, "No, this is just gonna backfire. You're just hangry. You need to, like, not do it." And then
Yeah.
I'm like, "Oh, I'm late for my talk with Ryan," and having to find, like, a genuine point, where you can find that genuine smile, find that genuine happiness. And I feel, I know it's not what you were talking about at all, but in some regard, like the idea of wearing a mask and not presenting that mask, not it's the struggle that I've been having is like, oh, I really want to be able to just kind of be myself and not feel like I got to hide. Sometimes you got to be a professional, all
Sure.
these things.
Sure.
And that's been the interesting journey because I feel like, especially with the platform we're on the topic of masks, like I think I'm more gravitated towards sincerity and being genuine as much as possible. So sometimes I do just want to come on camera and be like, I'm like pretty pissed off today.
Well,
But I
but,
feel
you talk about being pissed off as being, like, real, and anger is not like it's not a real emotion, it's a secondary emotion
secondary emotion.
that's a reaction to other things, right? So, if you're
Usually
pissed
it's a
off.
sense of loss or hurt. Yeah, it's usually one of
Yeah, or
those.
betrayal. I mean, even,
Exactly.
like, if you find out somebody lied to you, a lie is a harsh reconciliation with the truth, like, that's what a
Yeah.
betrayal is, so I always just try to focus on what's actually pissing me off. That being said, for years, I had the worst temper. I just had the worst temper, especially, like, when I was younger, and I just worked on it a lot. Um, Even now, I'll get pissed off, but God, I cannot remember the last time I actually hit send on one of those messages. Like, it's usually
Yeah.
everything I do now is, like, very carefully considered and calculated. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I once heard that most people, when they're communicating, it's either coming down to 2 things, um, a sense of loss or a loving communication, and usually the sense of loss comes in
Mm,
the form of, like, hurt,
mhm.
anger, all these other things. It's like it always comes down to that category. But with that in mind, has there ever been a character where in an emotional journey I brought this up to Coy recently, actually, of when I saw Inside Out 2.
Mhm.
That actually flashed into my head this morning when I was, like, getting really mad. When I saw it. I don't know if you've seen Inside. Have you seen Inside Out 2?
I have not,
Like, it deals with this character of
but
anxiety.
I've seen every episode of Agatha all along twice. That's what I mean, like, I gotta pick and choose, man. Gotta pick and
You
choose.
should watch Inside Out 2 with your watch.
I did recently rewatch well, I haven't watched Rise of Skywalker. I was rewatching the sequel trilogy and, like, for not for a live stream, but I ended up just, like, chatting on our Discord about it. It was a lot of fun, but no, I haven't seen it yet.
There is this moment with I won't ruin it. There's this moment with anxiety towards the end, and I feel like just me saying that, when you watch it, you're gonna be like, this might be the moment Greg is talking about. That has constantly stayed with me since I saw it, and I, like, reacted to this movie, and it literally has just stayed with me, and usually when I'm in the heat of an anxiety struggle, which, happens several times a week, I get this flash in my head of, like, "No, it's gotta slow down, gotta calm down, it's okay." Um, and even though I actually got the lesson from something I've heard my whole life, obviously. I've been in therapy for, like, over a decade, so I've heard this lesson forever. Yet there's something about the visual, emotional connection with this one moment that has stuck with me since I saw the film. Have you had anything like that at all that has just kind of been a checkpoint or baseline for you in some capacity that reminds you of a certain type of
Yeah, I'm sure I have. Need a second to think of it. I'll tell you, there's a line I go back to a lot. Not really an emotional connection. Have you seen the movie Adaptation?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, I used to see a lot more movies than I do now, which is ironic given what I do for
Weird,
a
right?
living.
That's why I started doing movie reactions because I was
Yeah,
at the same problem.
yeah. Huh. Well, anyways, Adaptation. The line in it where Chris Cooper is describing um, how into fish he was. He's like, I used to go in the ocean, get fish all the time, had aquariums everywhere, and then one day, fuck fish. And she's like, "That's it? No more fish?" He said, "Fuck fish." And I've not once since then stepped foot in that ocean. That's how much fuck fish. So that's how much fuck fish has been like one of my go-to phrases for just like, we have irreconcilable differences and I will never
Cool.
care about this again. Like,
Hmm.
for instance, um, Palpatine is your grandfather. That's how much fuck fish. Like, that was a huge checkout moment for me. Not with Star Wars,
Yeah,
not just with that movie, but with, like,
sure.
everything they were doing. I was like, "Oh," we just
Yeah.
did a video on this, but I was like, "Oh, yeah, you're making this up." It's like in the '90s, there was this thing called the Clone Saga.
Mhm.
Do you read did you read comics? You know the Clone Saga?
The Spider-Man one?
Yeah.
Yeah. I didn't read it from beginning to end. I wanna be
Sure, sure,
upfront.
but I
Did
was
not read it
there,
from beginning.
man. Like, you
Yeah.
wouldn't last a day in the asylum where they raised me.
Yeah.
So, just to give you, you fake nerds, I do.
Please,
I
please, I barely
hate
have a
that kinda
recollection.
thing. All you fake nerds who didn't read the Spider-Man storyline for 2
Hey.
years in the '90s. Like, I bought every issue of it, right? Because I was like, "Oh my god, look what's happening to Spider-Man," right? And the whole
Mhm.
thing was his clone shows up that was dead years ago, and then it's like it dragged on for a long time, and Spider-Man was going to this really dark place, and then his clone became a superhero too, and then, like, Aunt May dies. Actually, that was really sad. There's this moment in that issue where Aunt May dies, where they're up on the top of the Empire State Building. She is like she's got cancer or something, and she suddenly says to him, "Peter, what's it like?" And he says, "What do you mean?" She said, to swing through the sky like you do, and how could I not know that you were Spider-Man, and I'm so proud of you. Oh, that's so good. That's a comic book that'll make you cry, man. Amazing Spider-Man 400, David McElhaney, Mark Bagley. And I talked to Mark Bagley about it, and he's like, "Yeah, I don't remember that."
Oh,
Well, it
yeah.
was a million. The guy drew like
Yeah.
85 issues of 100 issues of Spider-Man. So anyways,
What a
I
response.
know, I was like, "Hey," I don't even think it was I don't think I was recording, I was just telling him, like, how much this meant to me.
Sure, sure.
Anyways, with the Clone Saga, right, um, I realized at a certain point, "Oh, they're just making this shit up." Like, it was just dragging on too long, and then right after, not too soon after, they brought Aunt May back because it turns out that wasn't Aunt May, it was an actress that Norman Osborn hired to pretend to be Aunt May because Norman Osborn's actually been alive for 20 years, and then it turns out because there was this whole thing where Spider-Man's clone was the real Spider-Man, and Spider-Man we knew was a fake, and they just all undid it, and I was like, "Oh,
Hmm.
yeah, I guess you're not reporting on what's happening to Spider-Man, like, this isn't there's no plan here," you know what I mean? It's
Yeah.
what I imagine, like, a lapsed Catholic would go through.
Yeah.
Yeah, I've never had that kind of crisis of faith, though.
Dude, I really appreciated this conversation.
Me too, man.
This was a conversation that I feel like I needed today, and, so I appreciate the gift of your time, honestly,
Wish I could stay longer.
Ouroboros. Alright, buddy. I'll talk with you soon, man.
Talk to you soon, Greg. Thanks so much for having me.
Of course, man. Bye.
Bye.